Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Technique Tuesday. My name is Ali Board. I'm an artist, an educator, and an author, and I'm currently coming to you live from my studio in Dorset on the south coast of England. Now, you might be watching this live via YouTube. You might be watching it on catch up. However, you have accessed this. You are astonishingly welcome. Now, what is Technique Tuesday all about? Technique Tuesday, the idea behind it started just before lockdown and COVID all those years ago in the dim and distant memory of 2020. It was a way of me being able to reach some of you who I don't normally get to chat to. It was a way of me being able to share projects and experiments. It's kind of evolved a little bit now. And effectively, what it's about now is the idea that you pose a question, or we're talking about something on social media, or I have an idea, or there's something that I want to work out, and I do it with you live. I don't do a lot of preparation, not because I'm being lazy, but so that you can see what it is that's occurring on the piece of paper. We can have that discussion between us. Now, where can you join in the chat? If you're watching me live on YouTube on Tuesday, I had to look at the date. This is how addled my brain is. On Tuesday, the 4th of February, no matter where you are in the world, there's no point me saying 10 a.m. in the UK, because I know for a fact we've got people from all over the world in the virtual room at the moment. You're very welcome to leave a comment in the live chat. I can see that some people are already saying good morning. It's lovely to have you here. If you're watching this on catch up, you can leave me a comment on YouTube, or you might be accessing this through my website, in which case there'll be a blog post attached to it as well. Now, that website, just in case you haven't come into contact with me before, is this one. It's www.learningtopaint.co.uk. It's a nice, easy one to find. And over on that website, you'll find blogs, you'll find tuition, you'll find materials, all sorts of things to hopefully help you out with your creative adventures. Now, each month I set myself a theme for lots of reasons. Keep me focused is one of them. But a lot of the classes that I teach on a regular basis, it's nice to be able to chop and change between the two. Now, this month, actually, for February, the theme is acrylic inks, but I've sort of broadened that out a little bit. Sometimes Technique Tuesday follows that theme. Sometimes it deviates from it wildly. Next month, it's going to deviate from it wildly. But this month, we're going to be talking about gesso. Now, there's so much to cover in this. I'm only going to do a small proportion of it, a small microcosm of it. We are going to talk about what sorts of gesso, what you can do with gesso, what it's used for traditionally, what I use it for, because I don't use it traditionally, unsurprisingly, and all those kind of things. So stay tuned. There will hopefully be something for everybody in this. But one of the first things I need to do is to say hello to all the people who have taken the time and trouble to be in the virtual room and to put a little message on the screen. So who have we got? Lovely Julie. Good morning, Julie. Bonjour, Rosie. Now, Julie's actually fed me an idea for a future TT. She might not know it, but she has done. Val, Stephen, Thea, Teresa, Trudy, Maureen, Annette, Hilary and Linda. I'm sure there are more of you out there, but no matter how you are taking part in this, thank you very much for joining me. I know your time is very precious. Now, what I am going to do is a tiny bit of housekeeping, just so that you can see a bit of the website, see where it is you need to go to find things, just in case you've not kind of come across me before, and then we'll get stuck into it, okay? So if you put that www.learningtopaint.co.uk into your browser, you will end up at my website. Like I said, lots of information on the website. Your page might look slightly different to this if you are accessing this on a smartphone or a tablet. You might not have these words across the top, but that's the bit that you potentially want, is where it says blog, YouTube, and we've got the Technique Tuesday blog, the tips and tricks blog. So the Technique Tuesday tends to happen on the first Tuesday of the month, unless I've got something very important booked in. Tips and tricks tends to happen on the third third Tuesday of the month, and everything in between. So if you wanted to access this broadcast, learn a little more about it, you can go to the Technique Tuesday blog. This is also the place, look at me waving, oh, honestly. This is also the place where you can find previous Technique Tuesday discussions. So last month we talked about acrylic gouache, we've talked about tonal values, pencil sharpeners, there's a deep dive right there in pencil sharpeners, mounting, framing, you can see there's all sorts of things going on there. And there's lots of older posts too. In fact, some of the older posts share whole projects with you. So you can go back and access all of those. I'm hoping that there is something for everybody on that blog. So that's the place you can find it, kind of easy to find. But if you ever have any questions at all, then please don't ever hesitate to get in touch with me. So my email address is ali, A-L-I, at learningtopaint.co.uk, and I love to hear from you. I'm sometimes a little bit rubbish at getting to my emails quickly, but I promise you if it's in my inbox I get to it eventually. So let's talk about gesso, shall we? Let me reach over and I made my desk bigger when we redesigned the studio, apparently not big enough. Let's reach across for a pot of acrylic gesso. Now, we do need to have a discussion straight away about the different kinds of gesso that you might come across. So generally speaking, and I've got to talk in general terms here, there are two kinds of gesso. I know that there are three, but there are two main ones. There is gesso, sometimes called gesso as well. It's a contentious thing. I'm going to call it gesso. If that's wrong, it doesn't matter, does it? You've got gesso, and then you've got acrylic gesso, okay? And it's important to understand the difference between the two because they do two different things. Now, most of the time, 99.9% of the time, when you talk about gesso, go to an art shop, buy whatever it is that you buy online, and we talk about gesso, it's probably acrylic gesso. It comes in a pot like this. And the reason that I know that is because traditional gesso, and let's call it that, which is a way of priming a canvas, is usually made up of a glue and a binder of some sort. And the glue tends to be rabbit skin size, and yes, it is. And then it's mixed with a binder and it's used to act as a barrier between the absorption of canvas and whatever it is that you're painting on it. If you're using a traditional gesso, most of the time you'll be using an oil paint. Okay, now acrylic gesso works in a similar way. It's designed primarily to prime a canvas. It's meant to be much easier because the preparation of traditional gesso not only will stink your house or studio out, but it's also quite lengthy, quite involved. So acrylic gesso comes in a pot already done. It is a polymer. Again, it's designed to act as a barrier between the absorption of the canvas and your paint. It's a polymer, so that means that it dries to a much more waterproof finish, more like a film than anything else. And it usually is a polymer binder of some description, and there are various things that can be added to it to give it body, and then sometimes a pigment as well. A lot of the times you will find gessos come in white, that is the most popular one, but you can get it in clear and black as well. I'm going to be talking about those today. Whew, so again, like I say, the idea of gesso is that so you can prime a surface ready to paint with acrylics. So that could be canvas, that could be wood, that could be chipboard, that could be anything that you find where you want it to stop it being overly absorbent, or you want to control the texture that is on the surface and then paint on the top. Most of the time that would be an acrylic. I'm a mixed media painter. That's not what I use it for. So that's the little rabbit hole we're going to disappear down today. And actually the application of gouache for the traditional sense, there's quite an art to it. It isn't just a case, unfortunately, of slapping the gesso on and good, we're done. What tends to happen is you need to apply one coat of gesso with all your brush strokes going in one direction. Then you need to sand it down very lightly. and then put another layer of gesso with your brushstrokes going in a perpendicular direction, sand it down. And obviously the amount of layers that you add, the amount that you sand it down, all of those kind of things are going to dictate what your final finish is on your surface. So I have done it in the past where actually I've kept my brushstrokes in to kind of give a texture. I've used a sponge to get a kind of a more pitted texture. I've used a roller, all sorts of things. There's lots of ways that you can experiment with gesso if you are an acrylic painter. There's even more ways you can experiment with gesso if you are a mixed media painter, and that's the bit that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to be talking about the use of gesso with watercolor paint because that is how I use it, and I use it to interfere with my watercolor paint in interesting ways. So I've got some examples for you. I've got some things that I've prepared for you, and we'll go through. If you have any questions at all, particularly if you are in the live chat, pop them in there and I will try to keep half an eye on the screen so that you can see what it is that so that I can see what it is that you are talking about. So should we go to that overhead camera? Let's go over there. Let's work up the technology. Here's an example of a place where I have used gesso to interfere with the textures that I'm creating on a background. This is a little portrait of my dog Riley a long time ago when he was a puppy. He's coming up 14, so this was a long time ago. And this is watercolor paper, as you can see, just standard 300 gram, 140 pound watercolor paper. And I've used this as a kind of intermediary layer between the collage that I've put down and the subject itself. Now, why have I done that? I've done that, well, because I like my collage to kind of push-pull. So I like to be able to see some bits of it disappear in others, but I also like the effect it has on the watercolor. So for this, I laid down the collage. This was a really simple demonstration. I seem to remember I did this through lockdown, actually. I laid my collage down and then I applied my gesso over the top. And what that does, you can see it makes the text disappear in places. It also creates some interesting textures on the background. Now, the thing that you need to understand with gesso is that it sits between two other products in terms of what it will do to your watercolor paint. And I have another sample. I mean, I said I don't do much preparation, but I've done quite a lot of preparation today, haven't I? Get me and my preparation. Here's some examples of what I'm talking about. So there are three media that I use with great regularity to interfere with my watercolor. I'm just going to take them out of this ring so that you can get a comparison. This is watercolor ground. Watercolor ground, again, designed to prepare a surface so that you can paint it with watercolor. So you could paint on plastic, glass, metal, tin, all those kind of things. Prime it with watercolor ground and then your watercolors would sit over the top of it. Now this one, let's see if I can, actually let's do it in the close-up camera so you can see what I'm talking about. You can see it's quite heavily textured. I've allowed it to dry very thoroughly between layers. And can you see it actually absorbs the majority of the colour? Where this colour is darker is just because it's sort of pooled physically in the cracks. Watercolour paint will always it'll give you the best result on plain, clean watercolour paper. But watercolour ground is a really interesting way of getting texture onto your watercolor paper. Again, like I said, if you want to interfere with the color. This was a granulating color, so you've got that kind of added bonus in there as well. Now I'm going to go to the other end of the scale. This is acrylic paint, so just ordinary run-of-the-mill white, titanium white acrylic paint. Now, if you look at those two things in comparison, can you see this repels the watercolor? This area in here is not where it has fallen into the troughs, because actually, if I get it to you sideways on, can you see there that there's no real difference in the height or the depth of the texture? So those where it's kind of darker, that's because the acrylic paint, it dries to such a plastic film that it's repelling my watercolor. Works really nicely when you heavily texture it. Quite interesting for techniques where you want to put it on and wipe it away. So that is, let's look at it in comparison to the watercolor ground. You can see the difference. Now, why is gesso interesting? Gesso is interesting because it sits in between those two things. And so it partly accepts the color because it does have an element of porosity about it. And it part repels the color. So you get, I can pretty much guarantee if I use watercolor ground and I let it dry properly, that's a massive caveat because I don't usually let it dry properly. If I let it dry for 72 hours, then it will accept my watercolor, it will create texture. If I use the acrylic, I could dry it in half an hour, overnight, whatever it is, it's going to pretty much repel my watercolor. And my gesso sits in between those two things. So from a mixed media point of view, that makes it rather interesting in the sort of effects that you can get by using it. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that gives you a bit of understanding. I quite understand if you're here because you're an acrylic painter, then you might not see the point of this. But if you are a mixed media painter or you like to interfere with the watercolors to kind of upset the balance of them, then this might be a new technique for you. So alongside understanding what gesso can do for you, I thought it would be interesting to do a comparison of gessos. Now, the reason that I'm able to do this is because I'm such an art materials hoarder. I have quite the selection of gessos going on. And actually, it was interesting for me when I did my little bit of prep yesterday, seeing the differences between them. And I thought I would share that with you. So here I have a piece of paper that I have prepared. Don't worry if you can't quite see my pencil notes clearly. I will go through it and explain it. I'm also going to apply it in the way that I like to apply it. And then we'll dry them off and we'll see how the watercolor is accepted by each. Now, there's lots of tools that you could use for applying gesso to create interesting marks. Let's just talk about those so that you've got a bit of a greater understanding. Of course, you could just apply it with a common or garden brush. You could pop it onto your paper or your canvas or whatever it is that you're using. If you have a nylon brush, you would get quite a smooth finish to it. If you were using something like a bristle brush or even a stencil brush, which is what this is, I couldn't think what it was called then, which is what this is, then you might be able to get some nice stippled marks or certainly some brush marks within it. That's another interesting tool. Colour shapers are quite interesting, these kind of spongy finished application tools that come in a variety of hardnesses and softnesses, or just sponges in general that could be used to apply it. You've got your good old mark making tools. If you've ever attended any session with me, workshop or otherwise, you will know that I'm very hot on mark making. I like traditional mark making tools in terms of kind of sticks and skewers and things. But in the workshop that I ran last weekend, we were looking at these kind of lids and caps which come on milk cartons. And we were using those for various things. I got an interesting ridged edge. You can use it flat. You can use it for circles. I'm a big fan of a circle. All those kind of things. And those could be pushed back into your gesso as it dries for your watercolor to fall into to make interesting marks. But this is my favorite tool. This is, well, lots of people call it a palette knife. I call it a palette knife. Actually, traditionally, this is not a palette knife. This is a painting knife. A palette knife is completely flat. It's in line with the handle. I don't actually think I possess any palette knives. It is designed traditionally for mixing together your binder, so that would probably be linseed oil, with your pigment on your palette. This is called a painting knife because this is the tool that you use for application onto the surface, and usually has what's called a cranked handle, so that you keep the blade away from the surface. Now, this is my favorite shape of tool. It's not the only one I use, but it is my favorite. This is, I don't know what traditionally it's called. I call it a spade. For very obvious reasons. I like it because it has the most contact with the surface. It kind of gives a nondescript mark when it goes down. And so you will often see me using this kind of spade palette knife for applications like I'm about to show you. So let's introduce you to the Gessos, and you may have already spotted, because you're clever people, a bit of a glaring error. I will come to that. So I actually bought one in for this. I had all of these bar one, and I'll get to that and why that was in just a second. So let's go from left to right. So the first one is the De La Rowney acrylic gesso. This comes from what's known as their Simply range. So this is their slightly more affordable, student quality type of gesso, because these things can be expensive, particularly if you're working on a large area. If you've got to prime a canvas and you've got to give it 4 or 5 coats, and it's a big kind of 30 by 20 inch canvas, and you want to prime it or texturize it yourself, these can be expensive. So sometimes a student quality is good. We'll come back to why this is one of my favorites in just a second. So this is De La Rowney. That's number one. I'm just gonna, oh no, that's gonna cast a shadow. We'll pop that one there. This is also De La Rowney, but this would come from their more professional range. This is designed to be used with their System 3 acrylic paints, or their Krylla, however you want to pronounce it. So a slightly better quality. And by that, I mean it probably has a better quality binder, better quality pigment. These, incidentally, this one is titanium white. Actually, it doesn't even say titanium white. This is white. This is definitely titanium white. We'll talk about the consistencies of them when I put them down. This is just to give you an overview of what I've got. The next one I've got is Winsor & Newton's Artist Quality Gesso. And as you can see, this is not white, this is clear. Now, why would you want it to be clear? You'd probably want it to be clear for 2 reasons. One would be if you want to tint it yourself. So you could add some acrylic paint. So maybe you're working on a project where you think, actually, I've already got a layer of colour down, or I want to have a specific kind of grey or umber or sienna or blue or whatever it is. You could add your acrylic to this, very tintable with small amounts of acrylic, and you can make it the colour that you wish. Or, of course, if you want to be able to see through it. Now, why would you want to be able to see through it? You might want to be able to see through it if the texture or the surface that you're painting on is interesting. So say you've got a piece of wood that has a really interesting grain to it, and you don't really want to paint over that and white it out or black it out. Maybe you want to keep that shining through. So you might want a clear gesso. Maybe you're painting over, you want it to kind of hit and miss with the watercolor, but you still want to be able to see maybe your collage materials. Maybe you've got a map or a piece of text or something that you can lay down and still be able to see what that texture is, but it's still going to interfere with your color. So like I said, this is Winsor & Newton. This is their professional quality, but it is clear. Then we have the one that I bought in. Now that I bought this in, I've sort of ricocheted backwards and forwards with this one. This is Liquitex, big fan of Liquitex products. This is their professional one. This is their white gesso. Now this is called a fluid acrylic gesso. And the reason that you might want to consider this over the others is if you are worried about your brush marks showing in it, if you really want to get a flat version of it, then this is going to prime it, it's going to add tooth, but it's going to kind of flatten out. Now, I haven't ever used this one before. I've done a sample, and I have to say, when I laid it down, I didn't like it. But jury is out, because I'm yet to see what happens with it when I put the watercolor over the top. So I might change my mind about this. You'll soon see what I mean in a second. Then you've got another one of my favourites, which is the Pebeo Studio. So this is their student quality acrylic range, called a universal primer. It's white, comes in large pots for your money. So if I've got a big project to do, this is another one that I reach for. All of these you'll soon start to understand as well. For me, not suggesting you do it, but for me, why I have such a variety of gessos. Just because they do different things, they feel slightly different on the paper. So that's the Studio. Now, this is the anomaly. This is a real favourite of mine, which is Daler Rowney's, again, their artist quality in black. Because I work on black watercolour paper a lot, or I want to use metallics or the like, I pulled this out very late last night, ready to do my preparation for today, took the lid off, and it is absolutely solid. So I'm going to need to get myself a new one of those. But luckily, I had an alternative in the box of nonsense in my shed where I keep everything. I've got Goldens. It would be remiss of me to not mention Golden as a company in this comparison. So we've got their black gesso too. I know that's a lot of information. I know that's been a lot of housekeeping, but let's get on to the application, because I want to show you the difference in what happens when you lay them down. Now, I'm going to lay them down in a way that I usually lay them down, from the point of view that I'm going to skim my palette knife over the surface, maybe create a little bit of texture in with them, so that when they are dry, you can see what happens when the watercolor is applied. I've had to do here's some I've made earlier, because it takes quite a long time to dry. So what have we got first? We've got the Daler Simply. So I'm going to take the lid off this. So one of the reasons that I like this is that it's a very thick consistency, and that means I can get some interesting textural marks out of it. What I'm going to do actually is pop all of these into the close-up camera so that you can see them more clearly as I go down. Just got to clear the decks. Here we go. So here is the Daler Simply. Can you see there on the back of my palette knife? It's not running. It's going to stick very soundly to that knife. What's it like? The consistency of kind of clotted cream is what I'd say. It kind of keeps its shape sort of almost more like a meringue than anything else. I'll skid that down onto the surface. You can probably see it hits and misses rather nicely, so I know I'm going to get interesting patterns out of it. I can use my palette knife or a sponge to make peaks and troughs in it, and those aren't going to flatten out. So if I'm looking to create a texture, say I'm doing a mountain scene or something in the foreground where I want all that texture to occur, that's going to be a really good one. Let's put the lid on that before I shoot it all over the shop. Next one along is the Daler System 3. So this is similar, but a higher quality. Again, you can see very clearly it's not going to go anywhere. I would say it's a slightly creamier consistency than the previous one. Just ever so. So can you see there? It's not quite as stiff. Bearing in mind, of course, you can always add other things to it. You could add a sand to it, or a pumice, or a carborundum, or something like that to get an interesting texture. Let's put this down. Again, hits and misses. If I take the bright light away, you can see how it goes over the surface. I can create my textures in it just a little tiny bit smoother. I can't honestly say that sometimes I make a conscious decision between the two, but these two are definitely some of my favourites. Again, let's stick the lid back on that. And cleaning my palette knife in between each application so you get a nice true representation of each one. Here's the Winsor & Newton clear one then. Let's take the lid off. Now this one's quite interesting because, as you can probably see, is more liquid. That is probably due to the fact that it doesn't have any pigment in there. So because they haven't added a pigment to it, it's going to be a slightly thinner consistency. This one is interesting because it's got a slight gritty texture to it. It's hard to explain, but it's if you have any, then you'll sort of soon feel it under your knife. It's not very gritty, but just a little bit. Now, can you see by comparison how liquid that one is? So that means I'm not necessarily going to get my peaks and troughs out of it unless I'm very clever with my palette knife. So can you see there, I've really skimmed it across the surface so it hits and misses. I can possibly get a bit of texture out of it, but look, in comparison, not the same. But of course it's clear. So I could tint it, I could lay it down over the top of other things, and still be able to see through it. Now the next one is the Liquitex one. This is that flow formula one, so much thinner. If I show you it in the dry section, can you see up there? Very little texture to it at all. And when I applied this last night, I was really quite shocked. I also couldn't get the lid off of this, one of the bugbears of my life, not being able to get lids off things. So I think I'll use the pour spout, as it was no doubt designed to be used. Let's see, let's hold it over the piece of paper. So look, can you see how liquid it is? Much more liquid than the clear version. And I really struggled with this last night, but I need to understand as well that, of course, gesso is primarily made for priming, not for what I'm using it for. So I'm not saying that this is a bad product at all. I'm just saying that for the things that I use it for, this might not work as well. So there you can see struggling to get it to skim. In terms of texture, I have a feeling that's going to self-level at the bottom, all of that stuff. What's next? Pebeo Studio. Let's just give this a good old clean. And we'll go over to this one. Oh, just all of these lids shed bits everywhere. Probably because I don't look after them very well. Now, this is a really nice gesso. Can you see it's got a different consistency again? This is odd, this one. I don't even know what to liken it to. It's sort of like, well, if you ever go and see people making cheese, it's sort of got the consistency of curds. So not as thick as my Daler Rowney ones, not as thin as my Winsor Newton clear one, somewhere in the middle of those two things. I can get it to skim. So you can see there I've managed to get it to hit and miss. And I'll get a little bit of texture out of it, but not much. Certainly more than the Liquitex, more than the clear one, somewhere in between. I am not saying any of these are preferable. I'm not saying they're right and wrong. I'm just stating what they do in terms of what I use them for. Now, I can't show you the Daler Black one. It's very similar to this one, just black. But I can show you what the golden version of the black is. Golden being the brand. Just got to clean my palette knife, get that nice and shiny. Let's have a look at the consistency. So look at that, really quite gloopy. That's why I wanted to be able to show you the Daler and the golden, because the Daler is quite thick. This one again, look at it, quite thin. But if you're working on black watercolor paper, this is interesting. You could of course use the clear on your black watercolor paper as well, but a different consistency again. Let's coat the back of that knife. Need to tap that away because I've got quite a lot on there. And of course this is going to show up really quite dramatically because I'm putting it on white paper. But I'm sure you understand by now that the consistencies are varying wildly. So let's clean my palette knife off And let's go back to the main overhead camera and we'll do a small recap and just to kind of take you through the different brands. So we've got the Daler Simply Gesso. That's nice and thick, got a really interesting consistency to it. That's a real preferable one of mine. Then we've got the Daler System 3 Gesso. Those was white as well. Again, a nice consistency, able to kind of keep the peaks that you can see there. Incidentally, it's not that I haven't got those things. These are all dry, so they're not showing up quite as well because they're not bouncing the light off in the camera. Then we've got the Winsor & Newton clear version, the Liquitex, the Flow formula, the Pebeo Studio. We'll pretend that the Daler is there. And then we've got the golden version at the end. These are all wet. I didn't want you to have to sit and wait watching gesso dry. So I'm going to just take a pair of scissors to my chart. And let's see if I can cut this without getting gesso either on me or my scissors. Might be easier said than done. It is going to be easier said than done. So I'm going to quickly reach for I thought I was going to be able to do that with scissors as well. I was a bit naive, wasn't it? Let's grab a scissors and a ruler and a cutting knife, and let's take care of it this way. So just got to try not to dip my ruler in wet gesso. Let's line that up and we'll separate them so that we can use one colour of watercolour over the top and get an interesting comparison. Let's also try, Ali, not to cut ourselves live broadcast. And then we'll join that up with the bit that I cut with scissors. Let's make sure that the knife will go through. I'll leave that to one side. I'll be able to remember which ones are which because I'm so used to using them. But let's go back to our main chart, which has now dried. Now let's have a think about what colour we might want to experiment with over the top of this. So here's my watercolour box. And I was thinking about, look at the state of it. I was thinking about what colour would be the best colour to show up the kind of intricacies of the gesso. So I think what I'm going to do is go for a colour that I know granulates. So these are my own brand of watercolours, by the way. So I'm going to go for the Dusky Violet. Also, obviously a bit of a signature colour for me, but I think that's going to show up what it looks like when I wash it over the top. I've got my pot of water here. What brush shall we go for? Let's go for my good old favourite mop brush, if I can find it. Things disappear in this studio with alarming regularity. Oh, I don't know where I've put that. Okay, we'll go for... Maybe we won't go for that. Let's go for the big version of it. That'll be fine. And then we'll pop it into the close-up so that you can see it clearly. So let's start with the Daler, the Simply. So I've got my big old... Oh, there's my little one. Can't see the wood for the trees. Typical of me. Give my brush a really good wash because I'm a terror for not cleaning things between sessions. I'm also a terror apparently for sloshing water over everything. Now, this Dusky Violet is a bit of a convenience colour. It's more than one pigment in here, and the idea is that it splits and granulates and makes interesting colours. But the reason I've chosen it to demonstrate what happens with the gesso is so that you can see the effect that the gesso has on the watercolour itself. So I'm going to roll my brush. So this is tubed colour that's squeezed out into the pans, then been allowed to dry, and we can then wash it over the top, and it's a nice consistency. So here goes then. So look at that. You can see straight away how the gesso is slightly repelling that colour, but also taking some of it on too. So let's fill it in formally or relatively formally with as few strokes as possible so you can really see what happens when the colour goes on. And if I pop it kind of almost all over the surface, you'll also be able to see what happens in the peaks and troughs. So here the colour is beading a little bit. Can you see there? It's got a nice rich colour where the colours hit the paper and it's repelling some of it. And down here in the peaks and troughs, you get that interesting texture. So that's the Daler one. Let's repeat that process over here for the System 3. Now this was quite a thick version that I managed to get on. I really, because of the consistency of it, really managed to get quite a barrier between the two. Let's put that on in there. So we'll swipe this over the top, coming into here and coming up the side. So again, you've got colour beading on the surface. It's not quite as hit and miss as the Daler Simply. Got a bit more of a smooth consistency on that one. That's quite interesting actually from my point of view. Here's the Winsor & Newton Clear. So this was the one that was thinner in the consistency, so we won't get such a barrier. It seems to take on more of the colour than the white counterparts, possibly because it hasn't got that kind of extra added pigment that's in there. That's the word I'm searching for. Let's get this filled in. This isn't very neat and tidy, but you can certainly see it as a comparison. So that's actually taken on more colour than the white ones. That's really interesting. I hadn't noticed that before, but of course I'm not able, because of the consistency of it, to get these peaks and troughs in it. So here's that Liquitex Pro, that really thin one that I hadn't encountered before. Let's whack some colour over the top of that and we'll be able to see what effect that has. Seems to be repelling, I suppose because this one is white as opposed to clear, seems to be repelling the colour more than the clear version. That is so interesting. Consider me fascinated by that one. I don't think I've noticed that before. Every day's a school day and all that. So yeah, you can see it's pushing the colour away a little bit, sort of similar to the System 3. Again, quite interesting. I'm not able to get the peaks and troughs with it, but I am able to get that kind of interference in the watercolour. Let's go back to, so this was the Pebeo Studio. This is one that I've used quite a bit in the past because I know how much this repels the colour. Let's wallop that on. Also, because I'm using such a tonally rich colour in the watercolour, I'm able to see much more clearly. If I was using a pale colour like a yellow or something like that, I wouldn't get that contrast quite as readily. So we've got that going on. That's interesting, isn't it? Repelling it a bit more. It's actually running quite a bit down the page. Can't use this one. And then over the black, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this in half. So the top half, obviously, it's going to repel the watercolour, but you're not going to see it quite as much where you swipe a dark colour over the top of it. But look what happens. I find this quite fascinating. You get like a reverse effect. Because it's black, you get an interesting kind of set of outlines going on. I think that's rather interesting. But I do have in my box of tricks as well, I do have a pan of titanium white gouache. So I'm going to, my brush is probably covered in purple, but let's give it a good old wash. And we'll, this is how I like to keep my white gouache, separate from everything else so that it doesn't tint it. And a nice consistency so that I'm not wasting any. Can squeeze it out into these extra large pans and be able to make it work over the top. So here we go. Oh, I've got the purple coming into it as well. That's rather exciting. So again, it is repelling that colour. It'd be great for mountains, wouldn't it? Let's make it join up with the purple so that you get to see. And isn't that just a delicious texture? I think that's rather exciting. Like I said, if you were doing a mountain or rocks or something where you wanted that kind of colour to appear and disappear, I personally think that's rather fascinating. So let's do a recap in the main camera so you can see what's going on. This, incidentally, is not a very expensive brand of watercolour paper. I use just a scrap ready for today's demonstration. So if you were using a cotton-based paper, this is not a cotton paper, this is a cellulose paper. If I was using a cotton paper, I would get different combinations. Again, those samples that I showed you before are done on Saunders Waterford watercolour paper. So you've got a sort of very different look and a very different texture as well. I'm just going to quickly answer a question that's come in on the chat. Trudy has said, where can I get one of those brilliant pans for the gouache for my tin, please? At the risk of promoting things, that would be learningtopaint.co.uk. So I have half pans, full pans, and then we have the extra large pans as well. Thank you for bringing that up. So I've got a cellulose based paper, and then we've got these different gouaches laid down with a palette knife. So we've got the Daler Simply in titanium white, the Daler System 3 in titanium white, the Winsor & Newton Artist Clear, the Liquitex Flow formula, the Pebeo Studio White, the invisible one, which I'll address another day, and the Golden Black. Somebody is saying, I can see a dog's head on the bottom of the black. This is like clouds, isn't it, where you can see different things. And then I've got my own brands of watercolor. So I've got my Dusky Violet, and I have my own titanium white gouache, white swiped over the top, so that you can see just how they kind of take on the color and repel it. This is not something that is going to be consistent. Why isn't it going to be consistent? Because there are too many variables. If you like to include this in your mixed media work, you do have to make your peace with the fact that you cannot predict how the color is going to react to it. We've done this comparison so that you can see what happens in terms of the absorption, repulsion, the texture that you can get out of them and the like. But there is also another factor which I haven't talked about, and that is the amount of pressure that you apply. If you push the gesso really hard into your watercolor paper, what you'll end up with are these quite interesting tide marks around the color. And so there is a discussion to be had about the amount of pressure that you apply or lift off to. So if you think, oh yes, this is brilliant, this is definitely something that I want to play with, you do just have to kind of give yourself a caveat of going, well, I understand that I can't really predict that how it's going to come out. I certainly can't channel it. You can see there what happens when those colours are applied. Can you also see how even on a cellulose based paper, so a paper that isn't going to necessarily show off the particulars of watercolour as well as they might, where I've got a colour that I know granulates, can you see how, like this one, the Pebeo Studio, for example, can you see how it's made the colour split into some of its component parts? So just in case you were thinking to yourself, why has Ali got all these different kinds of gesso? It's because they will have different effects, okay? So it will be like the Studio. If you're thinking, well, why has Ali got the Pebeo Studio and the Daler Simply when they clearly do very similar things? Look what that one does to the watercolor there. Look what that one does to the watercolor there. So there's that kind of going on as well. Lots of things to consider in terms of a comparison of gesso. And of course, I haven't even really begun to talk to you about what those can do for you with acrylic painting in mind, because obviously I'm really subverting what that gesso can do. And we haven't looked at what happens when you make mark making into it, when you use different tools, maybe different colors, different papers. So many variables there for you to enjoy. But I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight into, you may have a pot of gesso lurking in the back of your cupboard. In which case, get it out, do some experimenting. If you are thinking, well, I'd like to buy some gesso, but clearly it goes off because Ali's got one that had gone hard, do the thing that I didn't do. Treat it like jam. So when you've finished using it, take some beeswax wrap or some recycled polythene or whatever it is, and kind of put it on top of the paint. You'll peel that off next time and chuck it away, but it will stop the air getting to it. What had happened with mine was that there was only about an inch left in the bottom of the pot, and so of course that pot was full of air, and over time where I hadn't used it, the air had got to the surface and it had just started to solidify, and of course it dries like a plastic, so it forms a bond. Sometimes with things like watercolor ground and maybe some other products, you can sometimes put a little bit of water in and mix it up, but it wasn't having any of it. I tried it overnight and it wasn't happening. But hopefully that gives you, I'm just going to move this very wet object away while I bring my notes in. Hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into how you might want to experiment, some things that you can do with it. Do check out some of my other tutorials where I have used it. Now, some information for things that are coming up. Like I said, acrylic inks is the name of the game this month. So you will see various acrylic ink experiments coming out of my social media. If you like to follow me on social media, that is at Ali Board Artist. I'm going to put a plea out as well. Every time you see something that I post, or if you see something that you think is worthwhile on my YouTube channel, would you be kind enough to share it? Sharing is the equivalent of paying me for my time, because that means more people can see me, more people can interact with me, and we start to build on this fabulous creative community that we have created. So if you're not in a position to join one of my tutorials or to come to one of my workshops, honestly, sharing a post that I have done is worth its weight in gold. So I appreciate those things. Now, Technique Tuesday is back in March, on the 4th of March. Now, this one brings me out in a slight sweat, because I'm going to be doing a discussion around masking fluid. Now, I potentially have changed my mind about the masking fluid that I recommend. And so instead of working that out in the calm and quiet of my studio, I'm actually going to do that live in a broadcast. I'm going to kind of verbalize why I've changed my mind. I'm going to test out some tools. I'm going to go over how to use a ruling pen so that you can really get to grips with that. And I'm going to test it out on different papers, because I know that the masking fluid that I'm thinking of switching to doesn't work on all the papers that I like to use. So let's come back 10 a.m. UK time on Tuesday, the 4th of March. We can do that comparison between us, and you can give me your thoughts on any of the issues that you have with masking fluid, because I think masking fluid is one of those things that I talk about more than anything else. Masking fluid, mark making, composition and copyright. Those are the four things that I talk about. Thank you very much for joining me this month. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for chatting to each other. It's lovely to have you with me. Take lots of care, won't you? Hopefully I will see you on the 4th of March, and we'll catch up then. Bye.